All right, we're going to go ahead and start the June 25th, 2013 meeting of Santa Barbara City Ordinance Committee. And Ms. Wan, you want to start us off?
Yes. Councilmember House.
Here.
Councilmember Rouse. Here. And Councilmember Hotchkiss. Here.
All right, so we're all here. And Mr. Benson, we've got a couple things today. You're the first one up.
Terrific. Thank you, Mr. Chair and council members. My name is Cameron Benson. I'm the Creeks Division Manager, and I'm going to be presenting today a proposed City of Santa Barbara Stormwater Management Ordinance. Just to give you a little overview of what I'll be talking about, I'm going to give you the regulatory context and why we're here today. I'm going to talk about a stormwater technical guidance manual that the city prepared about 5 years ago to help guide design professionals in development and redevelopment projects with regard to stormwater. Talk a little bit about our threshold, regulatory thresholds and the standards. We have some new state and regional water board regulations. I'm going to explain those, and then we'll look at two potential ordinances that the city will be able to adopt. One is a local ordinance that's been in effect for about 7 years now, and one is a new state developed program. And then I'll get into a little more specifics about the stormwater ordinance itself. So I wanted to give you the regulatory context. It's not complex, but it is a little bit convoluted. We're here today as a result of a portion of the Federal Clean Water Act that was adopted back in the 1980s. And the Federal Clean Water Act has a section called the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. And what that regulatory structure does is regulates cities and counties for their storm drain systems and their discharges into creeks and ocean waters. And the United States EPA is charged by Congress with implementing the Federal Clean Water Act. The EPA has delegated that authority to the various state water boards, and our state water board has delegated some of their authority to Regional Water Quality Control Board. One of the first requirements of the NPDES program is to develop a stormwater management program. That's essentially our city's permit to discharge stormwater through our storm drain system into the creeks and the ocean. The City Council approved the City Stormwater Management Program and in April of 2006, and that approval from the City Council sent our proposed Stormwater Management Program up to the Regional Water Board for approval. It took them 3 years to approve it, but we eventually did, and it went into effect in January 2009. Part of that stormwater management program included the development of a stormwater technical guidance manual, and this is a best management practice guidance manual for design professionals. The Creeks Division administered the development of that guidance manual for the city. It was produced over a 2-year period, 2007, 2008. We had significant stakeholder input. I think I counted 36 different organizations and individual stakeholders that we worked with, and we had dozens and dozens of public meetings, and ultimately produced the guidance manual and brought that to City Council. The manual satisfied the City Stormwater Management Program requirements as well as the NPDES requirements in the Clean Water Act. The focus is to provide guidance to design professionals for compliance with development and redevelopment stormwater requirements. And the reason I'm talking so much about this is we have some, over the last 5 years since that guidance manual was completed, we noticed some things where people are having a hard time understanding some sections, so we have some pretty minor clarifying amendments which have been provided to you in a red line and or a strikeout and underline version. I think all of the edits are merely clarifying edits, and there's no real substantive changes in there. One of the things the guidance manual did was establish threshold tiers for what types of projects would have what types of stormwater requirements applied to them. And what we tried to do was develop some kind of using a rule of reasonableness and working with our stakeholders, develop a program so there would be fairness of application based on the size of the project. So we came up with a tiered system with 3 tiers. The first tier applies only to small projects, which is less than 500 square feet of new or replaced impervious area. The middle tier is for medium projects, which we defined as residential projects with 500 to 4,000 square feet of new or replaced impervious area. And then we have tier 3, the larger projects, and this applies to hillside residential projects that are greater than 4,000 square feet, commercial, mixed use, parking lots with greater than 10 spaces, and public works projects. And just to talk about these, when you're in these tiers, you have different requirements applied to your project. The tier 1 projects, any stormwater improvement BMPs are voluntary for those projects. Tier 2 has a list of suggested BMPs. All of them are low cost. They're non-volumetric, so they don't necessarily relate to how much stormwater you're producing. But they're, like I said, they're low-cost BMPs. A lot of times that works well as sort of an educational aspect where a property owner's not really thinking about the runoff coming off their property. They do something very small and low cost, and all of a sudden it opens up a whole realm of possibilities for them, and we have a lot of people that end up going far above and beyond the requirements. And then the larger projects, have standards that they need to meet in terms of volume of stormwater runoff and contaminants.
Mr. Benson, so you're saying that the best management practices kick in at each of these tiers, and the tiers themselves identify how they're dealt with, at what level they're going to be dealt with.
That's correct.
But its best management practices are required if they exceed those thresholds.
Correct.
And then the impervious surface, that includes like the building itself, right? It's not just the parking lot. It would be whatever covers the ground that doesn't let the water seep in that area?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and then once you get up into tier 3, that's where you have the volumetric standards, and these are for new or redevelopment projects. And there are 3 areas that the regulations can apply to. One is the discharge rate of stormwater leaving the property, the volume of water leaving the property, and then water quality treatment requirement. And that standard was essentially set for us as what is called an 85th percentile storm, and that's a 1 inch every 24-hour storm and a treatment requirement. These are some examples of some of the best management practices people have used in the city. On the left here is just permeable pavers in a parking lot. This picture on the right shows a vegetated swale coming off the parking lot. This curb here has curb cuts, so water can flow off the concrete areas, and it also collects water from roof drains and puts it down in this swale. And then, as you can see, if we have overflow or a storm that's producing more water than this capacity can handle, it goes into a kind of a conventional stormwater drainage system where you have a drop inlet and it goes out to the storm drain system and out to the creeks. Again, this is another photo showing a vegetated swale out behind some patio decks. And then another example is a planter box. This is up in a open courtyard up on a upper story of a building.
Mr. Rouse?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Benson, on the previous slide, when you talked about the swale and eventually the storm drain itself going into the system, does that mean that the swale itself has then reached capacity at some point, and then is that the basic concept?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Rouse, what happens here is the design requirement is that it be able to handle 1 inch of rainfall in a 24-hour period. And so if we get a really large storm and say we get 3 inches of rain overnight, it will probably overwhelm this system, and you'll have water sheet flowing over the top here and getting down into the drain system. But if we did just have 1 inch every 24 hours, this is long enough that you would the water would infiltrate into the soil and be treated that way.
So is the hope then the initial percolation and the initial rain will take out most of the solids and the bad stuff you don't want to go down to the storm drain system? Is that
Correct, yeah.
okay? Thank you.
Mr. Hodgkins has a question.
On that slide, no, the one you just did, they elevated garden or whatever you want to call it there. Is it necessarily elevated, or does that matter?
No, it doesn't matter, except in this case, this is on an upper deck, and so if it was built at grade of the patio, you would need something underneath it, because you're capturing and treating the water through its infiltration through the soil, and so you would need to have that soil below grade. If you're down at the street level, no, it does not have to be elevated.
So how is the water gathered once it percolates down through that 2 or 3 feet there? Maybe I'm too much in the weeds here, but
No, that's a good question. I don't know on this particular design, but I have Autumn Malanka with me, and she's a water resources specialist with the Creeks Division, and she may know that detail of this design.
Ms. Malaka.
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember Hotchkiss. This is a classic design of a planter box, and basically it catches rainfall from the open roof area. This planter box is designed to only capture a certain amount of rainwater. It's sort of a small assisting BMP to the other larger BMPs on the ground level. If that planter box is filled to capacity with rainwater, like if it's overwhelmed with a 2 or 3 inch storm, then they have little drain weep holes that aren't disclosed in the picture that will then flow out onto the patio and find the drainage paths designed into the patio.
so if it's not overwhelmed, what happens to the water?
The water simply is percolated through the soil, through infiltration and evapotranspiration, and naturally treated in the soil. And
So does it percolate down to ground level, because this is above grade?
just stays in the planter box and is taken up by the plants.
Really?
Yeah.
I think you'd rot the roots. Okay.
And
Well,
that's where the
as she-
water coming off the roof is going into it, almost like a filter, but it's being utilized. But it doesn't go on through. It stays right there.
Correct. And Councilmember Hotchkiss, this isn't just sitting there like a bathtub. There are, what Autumn was saying is there are weep holes, so there would be little cracks or openings down at the bottom. So once the water went through this system, it could come out on the patio here. It's just that at a 1 inch every 24-hour type of storm system, you're going to catch your water. It's going to evaporate through the soil. Soil warms up when the sun hits it, and you'll have water evaporating right out of the soil. So you just don't have your roots sitting in it like that.
Right, okay.
It'll filter
And
through.
is this fed by drainage off the roof, by pipes? No, just from what comes down? So, okay.
In this particular design, this is just coming out of the sky. Here you can see drain pipes coming down, and they actually feed into a system that goes down and runs through that swale in the other photo. Okay. Okay, so the State Water Board is required under the Clean Water Act to adopt a new permit, NPDES permit, for the entire state of California. They're supposed to do it every 5 years. I think the last one was adopted in 2003, and now they just adopted another one in February of 2013. So we've got a whole new regulatory structure in California adopted by the State Water Board and applies to the city of Santa Barbara. Our regional water board developed its own regulations. They require the city to adopt a stormwater ordinance for development and redevelopment projects. Our deadline for adopting that is September 6th of this year. Okay, as I mentioned in the beginning, we're basically here in a different posture than normal for the ordinance committee in the sense of developing an ordinance. In this case, what we have is the Regional Water Board developed its own ordinance that it's mandating that all of the cities and counties and universities in its jurisdiction adopt into an ordinance like a municipal code. When the Water Board developed their regulations, one of the things that Santa Barbara City staff requested was an exception to that new state program that allowed for municipalities or jurisdictions with a pre-existing local program that was in effect as good or better than the state's program that the city would be allowed to continue with its existing program. So that exception was included in the regulations adopted by the Regional Water Board. The city applied for that exception, and other jurisdictions also applied. The City of Santa Barbara was the only jurisdiction to have its pre-existing program approved as is. 2 other jurisdictions got a conditional approval, and that was the County of Santa Cruz and the City of Lompoc. So our proposal today is to continue implementing our existing program that's been in place since essentially since 2006, when the City Council first adopted it. The reasons for that recommendation are that we have been successfully implementing these requirements in this program since 2007. The city staff, as well as applicants and design professionals in this community, have become familiar with the requirements and the designs that will meet the requirements over those past 6 years. To compare the program, I would say the easiest way to boil the differences of the 2 programs down is that the state's thresholds for inclusion in the program are higher than the city's, but some of the requirements that the state has imposed are more burdensome than what the city has. And I think another way to look at that is, this is a stormwater runoff and water pollution from that is a problem that's developed incrementally as we've developed the city, and our program is designed to incrementally make improvements to improve water quality. And so what we were looking at doing was having a broader application, but a less burdensome requirement. And the state just took a different approach to the design of their program. In addition to that, the purpose of these programs is protection of creek and ocean water quality. And for the development condition that our city finds itself in, I think our program is more protective of water quality than the state program. And so with that, I leave you with the recommendations. We did take this program to the Creeks Advisory Committee, who recommended approval of the ordinance as proposed, the existing ordinance. And the staff recommendation is the same, that the ordinance committee forward this to the City Council for review and adoption.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Just for some clarification, the recommended recommendation for today is to review the proposed ordinance and then to send that on to City Council for approval, along with the minor revisions to the manual, if I understand those two
That's
things
correct.
are part
Yes.
of it. And I went through the manual and the revisions that you've highlighted, and I noticed that throughout the manual, it talks about the discretion of the city and, as required by the city. Early on, in the very beginning, there were some very particular changes in the introduction where it speaks about, let's see, the kind of review. For example, a project site is defined by the parcel. That was a change instead of project boundaries on a case-by-case basis, and then the new language, as determined by city staff. So perhaps to Mr. Vincent, I noticed that was important to change in a couple of places in the introduction, but throughout the rest of the document it talks about the city's process, the city's approval. Is the city's approval, is that process then city staff alone, or is there more to the process of review, especially with regards to their adherence to the guidelines that are here in this manual?
Well, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, it would be city staff implementing the terms of the guidance manual. The ordinance that is being presented to you sets a regulatory framework around the guidance manual. It establishes requirements that projects, either new development or redevelopment, and those terms are defined in the ordinance, in the proposed ordinance. If those projects require a building permit, it sets forth and puts them through the process of the tiering that Mr. Benson mentioned. The tiering process is laid out in the technical manual. It assigns different projects to different tiers, and then the requirements, the best management practices that are required of the various projects, depending on the nature of the project and the tier to which it's assigned, get assigned. And the the technical guidance manual and the city's process is more of a menu of how to satisfy these requirements. The requirements there are standards, and Mr. Benson mentioned the 3 categories of standards: the runoff, the volume, and the treatment.
Okay.
And-
Well, let me take the question a step further, because then you
Yep.
get right to the heart of it. Is this only at staff level, or does this show up as findings for the Planning Commission or ABR or HLC or a Single Family Design Review Board? I mean, does it come to that level of approval where they have to have signed off on that they have achieved this, or is that something that's already done in advance by staff and it doesn't show up at the Design Review Board level?
I would say that it happens 2 different ways. Yes, there are some projects that will only require a building permit, and staff will verify, as staff does verify compliance with other building code standards. Staff would be involved there. If it goes to design review, these elements, these best management practice elements, will become elements of that design.
Okay, and they may show up as conditions of approval for a major project, that kind of thing?
Exactly.
Okay.
So it works both ways. I mean, the staff is definitely involved in the early part of the design of the project, but ultimately, if it is a discretionary project that is presented to the Planning Commission too will be seeing those at least the design, even if it's not necessarily it might not get into a condition of approval per se.
But it would be part of the description of the project and
Exactly.
the design drawings?
It would be part of the project description, and the proposed ordinance before you today makes it mandatory that an applicant that goes through the process, whether it's ministerial or discretionary, as they go through the process, as they apply the best management practices that they wish to apply that also are deemed to satisfy the standards, the clean water standards, they become elements, project design elements. They will be on the plans for that project, and they are required to design and construct or install those best management practices, as well as maintain and operate them per their specifications for the life of the project.
Really, very
and those
clear.
are standards within the ordinance.
Very, very good. And this is what we've been doing now since 2006 or somewhere 7. Okay, Ms. Wan, do we have any requests to speak on this item? Is there anyone here who wants to speak to this item that's on our agenda right now? All right, very good. We'll have opened and closed the public hearing portion. Mr. Hotchkiss, you have some questions or
I
comments?
do. Thank you very much. We have homes that were built in 1900 here that some with big driveways, et cetera, and they don't meet these standards. What happens when they undertake a project? Do they have to, how do these standards then affect them?
Well, if someone's coming in for a development or in that case a redevelopment project, it depends what the size or the scope of their redevelopment project is, and then that will determine which of those thresholds are met, and then what the standards are that would be applied to that project.
Okay, that's a little confusing to me. What do you mean by the size of their redevelopment project? If they're adding a second floor, for instance.
Well, this is what I mean by the size. So in a Tier 1 project, if it's less than 500 square feet of new or replaced impervious area, they're Tier 1, so they have just voluntary compliance with any kind of stormwater BMPs, no requirement. If they're a residential project between 500 and 4,000 square feet of new or replaced impervious area.
Is it just talking about the impervious area, not their house if they're adding to their house?
Well, the house would be is part of the impervious area.
Okay, well, let's just put this practically. If I got a 100-foot long driveway that's 20 feet wide and I want to put a bathroom on my house, how does this affect my driveway?
Go ahead, answer that.
Yeah, Councilmember Hotchkiss. I'm the one who does a lot of the reviewing of these applicant proposals, and I'm pretty familiar with what triggers and how residents deal with these requirements. With the example you just provided, that would be more than likely a Tier 2 project, because adding a bathroom onto the back of a house would more than likely be under 4,000 square feet.
Yeah, except the driveway
New
is
area.
huge if I want to resurface the driveway.
That's only triggered if you're adding a new hardscape footprint or new impervious footprint area to an existing
Okay,
project.
so I can resurface my existing.
And replacing the driveway.
Sorry,
Okay, so you said 20 feet by
100.
2,000 square foot driveway and,
Yeah.
and a bathroom. That still would be under 4,000 square feet. And that's tier 2, which is simply a qualitative requirement where you disconnect your downspouts by turning them and putting them into a lawn or a landscaped area, simple things like soil amendments, those kind of requirements.
So my driveway doesn't have to be replaced with hardscape, with permeable surface if it's got hardscape now?
Not if you're meeting that 4,000 square foot threshold.
And if it's longer, because I do know there's some driveways that are longer that would not meet that.
If it's longer and you get beyond that 4,000 square foot threshold and into the tier 3 project, and you're then considered a large project, then you have the 3 requirements of controlling your volume, your rate, and the water quality of the stormwater runoff from your property. And that includes from all hardscape footprint, the rooftop, driveway, and all that. So you find a design.
So if I want to put pebbles down on my existing hardscape driveway that's over the 4,000 square feet, what happens? Anything special? Because there are places like this, and I'm just bringing this up because people are going to be wondering.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Hotchkiss, if you look at the draft ordinance, there's a section that deals with maintenance of paving. And if you're going in and you're doing maintenance of paving, that's specifically excluded from being counted as new or replaced impervious area.
People will be happy to hear that.
And so you look down what maintenance of paving means. It says, resurfacing with in-kind material without expanding the size of the impervious area, for example. I think that's what you're getting at.
Yeah.
That's considered maintenance, and it's not part of the calculation of the square footage.
Okay, thank you.
If I understand correctly, if the bathroom were added on it was a second-story addition, it wouldn't necessarily increase the impervious area. If we're added to the back of the house, it might. And so that's how the calculations get. Is that correct?
That's correct. I think it's important to point out that within these requirements in the guidance manual, there's a specific appendix that defines exemptions to these requirements. And one of those is a second-story addition, because that is not increasing the footprint, the hardscape footprint of a parcel.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Malonka. Okay. Did you have more, Mr. Hotchkiss?
No, I think I'm...
Okay. If you need, we can come back. Yes, Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Benson, I was, by the CAR, we have been implementing this program since 2006. Is that correct?
We've been implementing the stormwater management program since 2006. The tiers, this tiered system has been implemented since 2008, beginning of 2008.
And where does this happen in the permit application chain? Is this a new, or was it new then, and is anything we're doing today going to change the future of how somebody with new construction, for example, how that permit process would work?
If ultimately, if the council approves the pre-existing program that we've had in place since 2008, there would be no change to the existing land development process for the city. If the council were to choose the state's program instead, because we're really in a situation where we have to have one of those two programs in place by September 6th. So if we chose the state's program, we would be implementing a new regulatory structure and learning that as we go.
And as it says here in the CAR, we're not subject to CEQA. So, but had this gone through in the state level for CEQA, or is this?
That's a good question. I don't know what kind of CEQA compliance the regional board did. Do you know?
Found exempt.
Okay. So Autumn said she thinks it was probably the same exemption applied to the regional board developing.
But in any case, so we're codifying what's been practiced then for these last 7 years.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'll just make a comment. And that is that having been on the Planning Commission at that time, and really, actually prior to that time, and having us be very interested in water quality and what happens with runoff. Like, my goodness, it seems like this big conversation, and it seems so silly during the dry season. And then, when it gets rainy, it suddenly makes a whole lot of sense. And And the way these things are designed is just nice enhancements to the properties as well. And it's really very nice to be appreciated at the state level for the work and the initiative the city's taken on this. Unless there's any other comments, I'll entertain a motion to accept the staff recommendation.
Move staff recommendation.
Okay, and a second for Mr. Hotchkiss. All right, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All right, thank you very much. And thanks for your hard work on this. Ms. Malanka, thank you very much. Okay, and if you are here and want to speak on the next item, don't hesitate to get a speaker slip in the back and turn it in. I think we have some already, but if there's others, go right ahead. I don't think anybody hesitated. All right. Okay, we're about ready to get started here. Ms. Brooke, do you need more time, or are you ready to go? All right, please, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and council members. Today we're bringing to you a discussion about proposed amendments to Santa Barbara Municipal Code, Section 2887-170, which applies to the location and height of fences, screens, walls, and hedges. By way of background, that ordinance was originally adopted in the city in 1957, and it's really been in existence in that form since that time, with just a couple clarifying additions since then. It regulates the height of fences, screen walls, and hedges in specific locations on a property, and it applies primarily to residential properties. It does also apply to CO and CX zones, which are limited office type zones. But because it applies to the A, E, and R zones, that's both single-family and multifamily properties. But it's important to note that it does not apply to general commercial or industrial properties. And as you are aware, since 2008, we've had a suspension ordinance in place that has suspended the application of certain aspects of this code section, specifically to hedges. I won't spend too much time on that in order to allow people to speak on this proposed amendment, but if you have questions, let me know. But I will just say that the latest version of that suspension ordinance is set to expire March of next year, which is why we're undertaking this proposed comprehensive amendment to this code section. So the current code requirements, as you are probably aware, are the relevant ones are up here on the screen. For required setbacks, none of these elements can exceed 8 feet in height. Along front lot lines and next to driveways, they're limited to a height of 3.5 feet within the first 10 feet of a front lot line and within 10 feet of either side of a driveway for the first 20 feet back from the front lot line. And then with respect to corners, they're limited to a height of 3.5 feet within 50 feet of a street corner. And I'll show you in a graphical way what that represents for these two example properties. Again, just quickly showing you within 10 feet of either side of a driveway for 20 feet back. This lighter part of this hedge here in this example is showing where it's limited to 3.5 feet. This darker green is where hedges and fences and walls can extend up to 8 feet in height. So when preparing to amend the ordinance, we first want to ask ourselves, what are the intent of the regulations? And it's not explicitly stated in the code, but you can infer based on the location of where heights are restricted next to driveways and street corners that there's obviously a safety element involved. And with respect to interior lot lines, it's more a matter of balancing the need for privacy or the desire for privacy with other things that people desire, which is access to air and sunlight and views. So regulating the height of these elements on interior property lines is really more about the relationship of neighbors and property owners, and to a much more limited extent, the benefit of the general public. Now, where it does come more into play of the benefit or desire of the general public is along front lot lines, and that has a lot more to do with the community's desire for what they want to see along a streetscape. So long as we are regulating heights along driveways and street corners, the rest of a front property line, you know, it's not clear why that's regulated, but again, we can infer it has to do with possibly a desire to want to see, you know, openness, be able to see the homes beyond the front lot line, have a sense of openness along the street and the overall community character. It's really a challenge in trying to balance these competing objectives when establishing height regulations in these areas. So just a couple of questions, since we're considering the intent of the regulations, that I think the council and the general community should consider when we're addressing this code section is what has worked or not worked with the current ordinance? What do we seek to accomplish with this ordinance? What characteristics of this community are important enough for the city to regulate it? How detailed should the regulations be, and what level of staff time and resources should be devoted to resolving issues that may be primarily between neighbors? So getting into our proposed amendments, we would propose to add some new definitions to the municipal code that are not currently there to actually define what a fence, hedge, and screen are. We have working definitions on a staff level, but we want to actually codify that so that people understand what we're referring to. Now, getting into the specific parts of the section, like I mentioned before, interior setbacks, these elements are limited to 8 feet in height. We'd recommend not changing that for fences and walls, and there's a couple of reasons there. For one, they're a static improvement. They don't move and they don't grow. They're much more permanent. Also, a permit is required for fences or walls over 3.5 feet in height. And so I think we see less violations of this ordinance. Whether or not people obtain permits and learn the rules, the height rules, or maybe it's just a matter of the desired height, we don't see as many violations of this ordinance with respect to walls and fences as we do with hedges. We would like the community and the ordinance committee to consider possibly increasing the height for hedges along interior property lines. For one, a permit's not required to plant a hedge, so we see many more violations of this section of the ordinance right now, limiting them to 8 feet. They're not static. They're, as I said, many are out of compliance. They're difficult to enforce. So unless we spend much more staff resources towards enforcing this section of the ordinance, another way we could consider addressing this part of the ordinance is to increase the allowance to bring more of these hedges into compliance. If the community and the council decides that this is a desirable aspect of our community, then we might just consider bringing the ordinance to reflect what we see in town. I'll also just quickly mention the reason that we suggest...
Excuse me just a moment.
Mr. Hotchkiss has a question.
Did you say that,
Sorry.
say that last phrase again, you want to change the ordinance to reflect what you see, the actual practice that is going on now?
Correct. Mr. Chair, Councilmember Hotchkiss, that is what I said, as another way of looking at what we might want to codify for the community to have to abide by is, if this is an acceptable feature of our community, then why not have the code reflect that, rather than arbitrarily enforce something that may not be the desire of the community.
Sure, and you see this standard fairly widely in the city?
Along interior property lines, certainly, we see taller hedges there.
Thank you.
I'll just quickly refer to 2 other ordinances in the municipal code that have some regulatory function over height in terms of solar access and views. That's the solar access ordinance, which is where I based the 12-foot guideline for hedge height, because what the solar access ordinance does is it really applies only to structures on residential properties, but it does begin as a baseline, 12 foot as the maximum height for a structure on a property line, and then it goes from there. As you move the building further into the lot, it can be taller, but it does serve as a guideline for what's acceptable given sun angle and desirable access to sunlight on properties. The view dispute resolution process was established in 2002, and it's really only a private process for neighbors to resolve disputes regarding the blockage of light and views. The city is notified when a neighbor enters into this mediation process, but otherwise the city is not involved in it at all. And we're not involved in enforcing any of the agreements that come out of that process, but it's something to be aware of. It is in the code. It does lay out a process for this mediation or arbitration to occur. And if we were to consider increasing the allowed height of some of these elements along property lines, we may see more people entering into this process as a way to resolve disputes.
A question right there on that. Some of those disputes are, the assertion will be, the allegation will be that what's growing there is a spite hedge or spite fence or something. Well, fences, that's pretty easy because we'll have a hard edge to that. But the idea of a spite fence, is that's actually enforced in other places. Is that included in our definitions? Is it something that we acknowledge as a problem that we engage in enforcement, or is that something that would only show up maybe in allegations in a dispute resolution process?
Mr. Chair, it's not in our code in terms of the sections of the code that we actually enforce. We don't look at the intent of why someone did something. It's just there's a height limit in a specific location, and so in terms of what we actively enforce, we don't consider how or why it was placed there. I'm not familiar enough with the view dispute resolution process because we are out of that process, whether or not that's taken into account in the ultimate outcome of a mediation process. I don't know if Mr. Vincent knows.
Maybe Mr. Vincent has something, but we'll also hear from the public that might be speaking to that as well. Okay, thank you. Mr. Hotchkiss?
Yeah, I'm going to want to go into that more, the view part, later, if it would be appropriate, because I know some people are going to speak to that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So proposed amendments in terms of the front lot lines. Right now, the limit is 3.5 feet for the first 10 feet back from a front lot line. And as I mentioned before, this is really an area on a property where we need to consider the interaction of public and private spaces and the community character and visual openness. And here you see some examples of different ways that front lot lines are treated. Driveways.
On that go back to that previous slide, if you would, please. On the left-hand side, do you see how that hedge in the background is encroaching into the sidewalk? Is that exists? Where does our ordinance for prohibiting that exist? Where's that live?
Mr. Chair, I can't recall the exact title, but it does exist in that vegetation is not allowed to encroach onto public sidewalk. I think it's probably in the transportation street section of the municipal code.
So if somebody were to complain about that, we would have a basis for which we could enforce that. That's separate from this height issue.
Correct. We could have them cut this back so that it didn't intrude on the sidewalk.
All right, thank you.
Driveways, currently the height limit is 3.5 feet within 10 feet of a driveway for the first 20 feet back. In evaluating this section of the code, we would ask that you consider possibly decreasing what I refer to as the visibility rectangle, and I'll show you a diagram of that in a moment. And then also consider site-specific circumstances, because we believe in practice that the 10 by 20 foot area is sometimes more extensive than it needs to be, given on a specific site. In some of these circumstances where in some situations drivers are able to exit a driveway in a forward motion, and then you don't need as much visibility to the side in order to, exit the driveway safely. Also, whether or not there's a parkway or a buffer, which gives you more visibility for cyclists or other people who might be actually in the roadway versus pedestrians on the sidewalk. Topography, I mentioned, traffic volume and speed, and I'll show you a couple examples of what's currently in the ordinance, if this were a driver backing out of this driveway, here's the 10 by 20 area that's required to be clear, no more than 3.5 feet. And you can see it's fairly extensive. Definitely, in many cases, depending on site circumstances, it could be excessive. We might consider reducing that to a 10 by 15 foot area where you still, before the driver crosses the plane of, where pedestrians might be, they could still see someone coming down the street. Or what many communities do is they actually just do a triangle, which is, you can see when you go back to here, this is really the area that you need clear to see when you're backing out. This area is not adding a whole lot more since I can put up a taller fence right here. So should we consider a triangle? And this shows some of those examples of different driveway configurations where we might want to look at a site-by-site basis. In this case, you have a down-sloping driveway where even though this series of walls likely exceeds the code requirement, it may not present such a bad visibility issue because of the angle of the driveway, whereas this one, we might want a more restrictive code or height limit on this particular property because, as you can see here, this shrub right here might be blocking views more than on a flat lot. Street corners, they currently have the same height limit within 50 feet of a traveled way, which is how the code defines a street corner. So it's really taken from like the pavement area where cars are actually traveling. Again, here we might want to consider site-specific circumstances because it's not necessary in all cases to have that full 50 feet. Depending on the intersection configuration, we'd like some flexibility to be able to evaluate and allow less than that if it's warranted. The last component of our proposed amendments has to do with building in some administrative authority with some guidelines for us to deal with some of these more challenging situations where we haven't had the flexibility to allow exceptions to them without going through a formal modification hearing process. And that is just to allow building code required guardrails to exceed the height of fences or walls, allowing some decorative elements, addressing topography on the site and being flexible with respect to that. I mentioned driveway, street corners. Corner lots is another situation where if someone is on a corner lot, they have that front lot line height restriction on 2 of their 4 property lines. And we have allowed flexibility through the modification process for people to have a higher fence or wall along their secondary front lot line to be able to enclose some private yard. We'd like to be able to do that without having to request a modification and go through that time process if we can do that at an administrative level. So here's just some examples. As I mentioned, allowing a guardrail on a compliant wall, decorative elements, again, addressing site topography where it's not easy with the static code requirement to apply it in these situations where the level of where you might measure a wall is not consistent. And then also considering allowing, again, decorative elements like arbors or other entry elements.
Mr. Hodgkiss has a question.
Thank you. Would you go back to that last slide, please? Okay, with the guardrail up above there, or is there an objection to that or not? Clearly that's a safety element. You don't want somebody tumbling over that and on the pavement.
Mr. Chair and Councilmember Hotchkiss, currently the code would not allow this without a modification approval because it exceeds 42 inches within the first 10 feet of the front lot line. So people have had to get modification approval to have a guardrail on top of a retaining wall like
Well,
this.
if you got kids at least, or I mean anybody, you're going to want something there. So are we saying under these new amended regulations that would be okay? You wouldn't need a mod?
Exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
thank you.
It would just be allowed by the code. So in closing, the point of today's hearing is really to provide direction to staff. We have a series of other public hearings where we want to seek additional input on this matter. We wanted to begin this amendment process with the ordinance committee to really get some direction so that when we have these subsequent meetings, we have, can have focused discussions, can be, have a sense that we're going down the right road before we return to the ordinance committee. So some questions to consider. We've talked about hedges as being different elements with these code regulations. Should we really be treating them differently? Should they be subject to a different height standard than fences and walls? And then considering the extent of regulations that we want in the city with respect to these height restrictions in interior setbacks, front lot lines, driveways, and street corners, and then also the extent of the administrative authority that I briefly touched on just a moment ago. So our next steps, we're scheduled to be at the Neighborhood Advisory Council meeting on the evening of August 14th to continue this discussion. We plan to then go to the Single Family Design Board and seek their input, the Planning Commission later this year, before returning to the Ordinance Committee possibly in December this year, and then to City Council before the expiration of the current suspension ordinance, which is in March 2014. So that concludes my presentation. If you have questions, we have City Planner Betty Weiss here, Derek Bailey, our Supervising Transportation Engineer, and Steve Foley, Supervising Transportation Planner, to answer any of your questions.
Okay, great. We have some questions here before we go to public comment. So go ahead, Mr. Hotchkiss.
This is going to attract a lot of public interest, as it should. Are we only having those, if you go back a slide, those opportunities for people to chime in, or is that it?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Hotchkiss, these are our planned, organized and noticed public hearings. If people, so there's people are certainly welcome to speak at these meetings. We also have, of course, written input. But if you have suggestions for other ways that we could seek input or other meetings,
it's probably
we might
opening a can of worms, but I think it might be necessary that we have a dedicated hearing of some sort to allow for public input on this at the Faulkner Gallery or somewhere. It's just a suggestion. I'd like to know what you all think.
Okay, Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was concerned about some of the traffic safety elements. If I could maybe have Mr. Bailey come forward, please. And the view, was it the visibility triangle concept for around driveways? Is that something in other communities that seems to work, and is that dovetail with your beliefs as far as traffic safety?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Rouse, yes, it's a very common requirement in most communities. As Renee said, the current requirement that we have of 10 feet by 20 feet is probably excessive. It exceeds the length of most vehicles these days, so you don't need to have a restriction further ahead than where your starting point is of where you need to be seeing from. So in terms of whether or not it's needed, I believe it is. But as Renee said, I think we can reasonably back off what is required today.
Well, I know we're talking about hedges, but I find the same issue with a lot of times with parkway trees on corners. The restraining line that you stop behind, but you have to go quite a ways forward, sometimes out into the opposing traffic lane to get. And so, is there from a macro traffic planning and safety view corridor? Is that something that can be approached or should be approached in this process?
I know Tim Downey in the Parks Department is we're looking at that as part of his urban forestry management plan that he's working on, and I have provided them with some information that we would like to see incorporated into that plan as far as good placement of trees. It's a real balancing act. If we were Caltrans, there would be no trees at all near intersections. They like it wide open, and from just a pure sightline preservation standpoint, it's the thing to do. But we recognize that there is more to building a community than just being able to see 600 feet down the street. So sometimes it means strategic placement of trees so that there are windows that you can see through trees. And And as long as we can do that reasonably, I'm comfortable having trees in the parkways near intersections within
But
reason.
I was just kind of curious, as we're talking about people's private property, then we have other issues that
Right.
are on the public right of way. So thank you.
And while you're there, Mr. Bailey, I appreciate that. I know, just on the tree thing, I know that there's other studies that say that the trees help slow traffic because they've changed the perspective, but that's not for today. The question on the corners, though, we have a lot of places in town where people have very, very tall hedges right up to the corner, even on top of a wall, perhaps, and then you'll see this in the Upper East. You see it all over, I mean, West Side. And we somehow negotiate those intersections pretty well. I mean, we come up to an intersection and there's one of those where there's a hedge right up to it, but there's still a sidewalk and then there's the parkway on both sides, and you're up to the line. You can see really well. So I've never quite understood the rationale for the 3.5 feet on a corner when, in fact, I mean, unless there were no sidewalk and there were no parkway and it was right on the street, that might be different. Or the other issue that I mentioned earlier where they've let it overgrow and now it's all over into the sidewalk and public right-of-way, and then that's a whole other thing. But if it were kept within outside of the public right-of-way up to a corner, from your perspective as watching out for those kinds of things, does that really impede people's sight? Do we need to have a 3.5-foot requirement at a corner like that?
Mr. Chair, as Renee mentioned, we don't know exactly where the 50-foot triangle requirement came from, but my suspicion is that it's very similar to other communities as well, and it is addressing the most critical condition, I guess you would call it, and that condition is where there is no traffic control at an intersection. So there's two vehicles approaching an intersection at the same time at a relatively slow urban speed, but there's time for them to look across the corner of a lot and see one another and act appropriately. That's a pretty rare condition in Santa Barbara.
You said uncontrolled, so not a two-way stop or a four-way stop, just
No
not
control at
any.
all.
We only have a few. I mean,
Right. So what you mentioned, like up on the Upper East Side,
Right.
Typically hedges that are along a property line up there don't affect traffic. So what we have there is there's typically a parking aisle along the edge of the roadway, then a parkway, and then a sidewalk. That's a lot of buffer between the traveled way on a street and where vehicles are pulling in from a cross street. And they're typically able to pull far enough ahead of where that hedge would be so that hedge is not impeding their visibility. What's tough to define is site-specific. That's a really good example of where a hedge right up to a corner doesn't impede sight lines. But we go to other areas of town where the roads are very narrow, there is no parking aisle, there is no sidewalk, there is no parkway. And if we have a hedge that comes right out close to the traveled way, then there's very little opportunity for vehicles to see one
sure. And
another.
we see this in the more up in the Upper Riviera and in the back areas there where
Absolutely.
there's no sidewalk even. And so, is there, you use templates, turning templates for backing out and stuff. Is there like the template of an intersection that then gets turned at 45 degrees that you could then have something that could be laid on any given intersection that you could utilize or that could be referenced in this that would give you the authority and the flexibility to allow for
Mr. Chair,
landscape design?
that's actually something we were looking at as we were developing this with Renee. Some cities, what they've done, and I think it's a really good approach, is they do have templates, and it really lays out the different scenarios that there are. Like the higher the approach speeds, the farther down the street you want to be able to see. So it takes into account those conditions, how much space you have between the edge of the traveled way and the front of your vehicle, the approach speeds, all those sorts of things. So there are templates that we could develop that could guide us.
I see the Derek Bailey app for traffic engineer's cell phone that I can go to any given location, and we'll develop that in coordination with you, Mr. Bailey. All right, thank you. So we have a number of people who want to speak, and not that many, but enough to count. So the first is a little group here, and Mr. Huffman, you can come on up. There's There's, let's see, is Pamela Stafford here today? Thanks, Pamela. And Richard Powell, and then Diane Powell. All right, great. And you've given your time to Mr. Huffman. So, Mr. Huffman, you have 8 minutes, and I appreciate what you sent to us in advance. That gave us something to read and be prepared with today. So come right on up. If you wish, you can sit down there. You can be up here, either one. This is your typical place.
Mr. Chair and council members, thank you. Hello, my name is Kurt Huffman, and I represent a small group of diversified property owners. We believe the current ordinance canon should be improved upon, as Renee mentioned. The basic point of this ordinance stems from the simplest of legal rights, which is your rights stop where mine start, and that is you can't yell fire in a theater, things like that. Every citizen has a right to do whatever he or she wants with their property, so long as it does not interfere with neighbors' rights to enjoy their property. And for this reason, we all agree to building restrictions, noise restrictions, parking restrictions, light restrictions, sanitary restrictions, animal restrictions, setbacks, zoning, and a host of other laws. And there's substantial precedent for hedge height limitations in communities with common and small lot sizes. As you said, we have provided our own approach in a separate document. We're not going to focus on that today. We're just going to focus on staff recommendations. We believe the city should use an owner-initiated approach whereby Santa Barbara property owners and occupants provide input to a consensus building group. I've done consensus building with both civil and corporate matters before. This would limit city resources to just vetting out citizen-based consensus, and then the city would study and consider solutions provided by that consensus building group. We would acknowledge that one size does not fit all approach, and it cannot fairly represent all of us, as there are several unique situations and conditions that property owners face. Certainly there are neighbors in agreement, and there are neighbors who are not in agreement. That seems to be one of the primary issues. We obviously recognize that hedge heights in Santa Barbara are a complex and sensitive matter, compounded by the inconsistent enforcement. Any ordinance will require careful consideration and a multi-pronged approach. Similar to the moratorium, we fear unintended consequences. One could be that every downhill owner would have control over uphill neighbors' views and property. Another such consequence could be just kicking the can down the road, with certain people violating the current hedge ordinance would then violate the 12-foot restriction. Or right back where we are today, further discord, but just with higher hedge heights. We'd like you to know that silence is not a consent. People were made to wait, and they have waited, but not without impatience. Just because we haven't complained, we've been waiting. Hedges are being planted right along the curbs in direct challenge to the existing ordinance, and hedges in compliance as of 2008 are being left to grow indefinitely. Many are at 12 feet now because they grew during the moratorium. Raising hedge heights is really rewarding bad behavior. Those that violated the ordinance because they knew there was no enforcement. The historical hedge height restrictions are based on logic and are not arbitrary. Cars and humans have not changed that much in height and length over 50 years. The reasoning in support of the moratorium generally was that a large number of hedge-related complaints in 2008 were received from the public and created discord, but that was subjective and really not a cause for all of Santa Barbara to change our viewscapes. People purchased homes prior to 2008 with ordinance in place, and occupants are now confronted with new hedge heights that would suffer nuisance and infringement on their quiet enjoyment, resulting in diminished property values. Dealing with ill-willed neighbors requires legal fees and a never-ending litigation loop. Deepest pockets will win. Even a court order or judgment does not ensure enforcement. Unfortunately, the view dispute resolution has not proven to be an effective vehicle for neighbors who are truly in dispute. It requires mutual cooperation, and some neighbors are just not cooperative. We really don't want the city to pick winners. The winners will be the wealthy and the spiteful, along with attorneys on both sides. And we did find that there is no legal precedent for privacy protection. People in Santa Barbara come from all over the world and are different and come from different social norms, customs, behaviors, and ethics, some of which are not necessarily what the majority of us would think are neighborly or reasonable. Courts and legal action are not the solution for a civil society, nor do they represent the good neighbor policy that the city promotes. I just brought along a 4-foot pole. This is the additional height that we're asking people to consider. So I'm 5'9". I can reach 7 feet with my hand. So A foot higher than that would be the new hedge height at 12 feet, which to me seems unconscionable, because now it's not about my right, it's about somebody else's right to infringe upon me, assuming that there's discord among the neighbors. Consenting neighbors is a different situation. We respectfully plead that the Ordinance Committee adopt the following. Delegate to a group of owners that can build consensus with a comprehensive plan or address each aspect individually. Use city resources for other matters until it's time to vet out the owner-initiated input. We can consider all the historical issues that got us here and then deal with each one individually. We'd review input from people that were negatively affected by the 2008 moratorium and those who've been negatively impacted by the view dispute resolution. Hedges are non-static, and that's part of the issue. The battle is ongoing. We'd also talk to the fire department, get dispensable face regulation input. And we note that the solar access comment really only relates to structures that have normal setbacks. It's not really an approach here. We respectfully disagree that street frontage are primarily an issue of community character. An automobile needs 85 feet to stop at 25 miles an hour and 136 feet to stop at 35 miles an hour. Most jurisdictions limit street frontage heights for this same reason. Friendly neighbors could have 10 to 12-foot heights, but we recognize that no other jurisdiction known allows 12-foot heights. Most are 6 feet or 2 meters. Hedge heights between uncooperative and non-consenting neighbors should continue at 8 feet with appropriate grandfathering of pre-moratorium and pre-1957 situations. We also disagree that that hedges are less permanent than fences or walls. One's organic and one is not. But other than that, really permanence is not a relevant factor to this issue. We also like for any amendment to consider several issues, including the complaint volume, economics, such as fees to be generated, city workload, fire, moisture control, emergency egress and ingress, water usage. We'd like to have an ability to, you must comply to complain. I think nexus is important. You can't complain about somebody that's not directly around you. And most importantly, deal with enforcement issues. We'll be right back in the same boat. So many law-abiding property owners, including us, have not complained because we trusted our government to complete the review process. Just want to emphasize, past silence is not consent. Laws governing civility only work if people abide by them or there's meaningful enforcement by the government or its appointee, which could be a citizen-based group. But unlawful and irrational people do not care what the law is, and the lack of enforcement creates an opportunity for good people to be taken advantage of by spiteful or irresponsible people. So in conclusion, going forward, citizens such as those present here can gather and develop consensus, present process and ordinance to city personnel, such that the city is not burdened with this time-consuming effort. A fair compromise can be reached where all are incented to comply with the reasonable ordinance through accountability and economic balance, i.e. fees, considering the rights and responsibilities of all stakeholders. I'm not favoring any one position. It's just a matter of getting everybody to buy in. So let's be a city of trees with hedge accents rather than a city of green walls. Thank you. I'll provide comments.
Great, thank you. You have 5 seconds left. You could reserve that if you'd like for no. Really, thank you very much. Thank you. And we have a question from Mr. Hotchkiss. You want to stick
If I could summarize, what you're saying is set standards and allow those standards to be abrogated if by mutual agreement between neighbors.
Go ahead.
Chair and
Yes.
Councilman Hotchkiss, yes, under many situations, we believe that there are many situations that could be built into an ordinance where everybody benefits, including consenting neighbors.
Let me just go back to my question. Have I got that right? That
Yes,
basically
consenting
we ought to
neighbors.
set standards and then those ought to be allowed to be, with mutual agreement, ignored.
Mutual agreement ignored with an application, a permit, a fee to generate the
Thank
economics
you.
available.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. All right, good. We'll keep going with public comment, and the staff will want to respond to some of these things, I'm sure, and we'll have a discussion. Mr. Burke, Robert Burke, followed by James Safide, or Safid? Safid, all right. Scafid, okay, thank you, sir. I'll try again in a minute. Mr. Burke.
Mr. Chair, members, my comment is public comment and not on the subject at hand. I meant to talk at the beginning. Last time I appeared before you, I used the term fat cat, and I used it in a pejorative sense, in a put-down sense, and that's what it was, and that is not acceptable behavior. So I've come to apologize to you for my use of that term. Thank you.
Great, well, thank you very much. It's rare enough. Okay, James. And it's Scafidi?
Scafidi.
Thank you, sir. And followed by Nick Bartolini.
Thank you. I'll be very brief, but I want to follow up on something that staff mentioned and talk about the interaction between the hedge ordinance and the view ordinance. And I'm a lawyer in town with the law firm of Beineck, Favre, Archibald Spray. I practice land use law, and so I'm pretty intimate with these sort of issues. There's what we that practice in this field consider to be a famous case in Santa Barbara where a judge interpreting the view ordinance looked to the hedge ordinance, this is a 2006 case, and required the individual to keep every plant in their yard at 8 feet. Right? Now, I don't think that was the intent of the view ordinance. I don't think that was the intent of the hedge ordinance. But the judge did what the judge thought was right. I don't think that was City Council's intent. But I would only ask that as you consider amendments, that you would consider the impacts that the decisions you're making are going to have on other aspects of the city ordinances. The view ordinance, rather the view ordinance, as was referenced as a private cause of action between neighbors. And in fact, it is. But these disputes end up in court, and these disputes end up with injunctions. And people have to live under these injunctions forever. All right. So the decisions that you make are not merely where two neighbors sit down and decide how high a hedge is going to be. It's two neighbors who are appearing ultimately before a judge, and the judge looking at other aspects of the city ordinances, trying to figure out what is City Council trying to tell us that the law should be. So I would just ask that as you amend this, as you look at what you're going to do, try to inform the people who are going to be making decisions what your intent is and what you're trying to accomplish, so that we can avoid ambiguities that might result in some sort of injustice. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, Nick Bartolini, followed by Jarrett Gorin, please.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm Nick Bartolini. I'm an ad hoc representative of the Upper East Association. I've been here before, and my purpose for being here today is to transmit a cover letter here, some guiding principles, which I've read someplace, and the attachments which go back to meetings in 2011 as such. Some of which, I guess, from my recollection, Mr. Rouse and Mr. Hotchkiss seem, from my notes, to have agreed with. And this is relative to neighborhood adherence procedures. The point of all this is that, very simply, I think part of the guiding principles for the staffs as they go forward is that considering, first of all, Santa Barbara is a very eclectic community. It varies all over the place. I've lived various places there. And people select the areas they want to live in. I live in the Upper East because it has sidewalks and lights, and it's not Montecito, rural, and all the rest of it as such. The second point is that Upper East, by definition, has an awful lot of properties that are grandfathered. So when you take a long list of things up here, they'd be null and void anyway. And people have learned to live with it. And you would know that before you move there. But the major point I'm making, I guess, is that a proven management philosophy is empower as lowest down as you can get, not denigrating positions, but closest to the front line, the action, the lieutenant in the trenches, the people in the neighborhood association, whoever it is, as much as possible. Get it down there and take the workload off of you gentlemen who are paid for your position, but you got a very heavy responsibility, and the staffs in which are overworked as well as such. So simplify it, key management principle. And I think if we just thought about that, if the city would think about that, so many of these things, which I'm expanding a little bit here, but I think you get caught up in an awful lot of minutiae, stomping on ants while the elephants run by. So I would suggest on this principle specifically, height of hedges, setbacks, and all the rest of this stuff, delegate it to all of the areas of Santa Barbara that I know of. There's a Mesa Neighborhood Association. There's an Upper East Association. There's Montecito is not part of it, but there are associations of like people. I would say a very good amendment just to not kick this thing ahead, but just sort of say, look, in terms of these types of things, because the problems are different in every neighborhood. Okay. They're eclectic. You just relegate it to or assign it to the responsibility in the case of the Upper East. The Upper East Association was very active, very well managed. And if I want to do something, I go to them. They're very responsive.
Like a first step.
And say,
Okay.
that's the first step, and say, look, I'd like to do thus and so, and I have the written agreement of my two or three contiguous neighbors. I want to put a wall up, I want to put a hedge up, so on and so forth. And they agree that we're better off doing what I'm doing than where we were before.
Great.
And that they have no problem with it. When I have that, I go to them and say, this is what I'd like to do. They bless it. They are the control dictator. And then...
Well, I'm
with-
going to
with
ask
their-
you to wrap it up, but that's good. Go ahead.
with the blessing of the contiguous neighbors, the Upper East Association, I submit that with my plans for a building permit. That's it. Finito. I read up here about 5 or 6 different sessions on that. That is a lot of manpower, time, wasted energy, in my view, and I come from a large corporation, by the way, that I think just it would be, well, empower them, delegate it downward, and reduce the workload and the encumbrance of Mickey Mousing around and 10 feet, 6 feet, all the rest of it. The community is just too eclectic for that.
Okay, thank you, sir. We got your point. Very clear. All right, Jared Gorin, followed by Ann Harkey, please.
Good afternoon, Chairman, council members. I'm Jarrett Gorin from Vanguard Planning, and I'm a private land use consultant. I represent a lot of private property owners. We regularly come up against this very thing. It has been sort of on hold with this moratorium, but I'm really glad to see that we're going to come up with a permanent solution here. And I think that staff is totally on the right track with their approach. I like some of these, general concepts, particularly the idea of, maybe we should revise our ordinance to match what's reflected in the community. I think the community is telling us sort of what its values are by how it is out there in reality. And I think that's a fantastic approach. Also, I have clients that are frustrated, and I know that staff has a lot of challenges with this one-size-fits-all approach that the current ordinance is, and it's good to see that we're looking at changing that, and I'm totally behind that as well. I read the staff report. I agree with pretty much everything staff is saying here in their approach. The one thing I'm really going to talk about is the hedge heights on front lot lines, and really just hedges. I think walls and fences are a different creature than hedges. They're static. Picturing a whole street where everybody's built 8-foot walls is a lot different than picturing what a street might look like with lots of rows of 8-foot hedges. And I think that these two things are two fundamentally different categories that it may be easier to address them as two separate things in our ordinance rather than lumping them all into the one category. So as to hedges on front lot lines specifically, we have this idea of we're trying to infer intent backwards onto a 1957 ordinance of, were we intending to encourage community interaction, facilitate public access and views into private property. I think that we may be retroactively imposing some current planning theory on some, 1957 values. I'm not sure if that was really what they were thinking in 1957, but regardless, I think that's sort of it has a very distinct social engineering characteristic to it, which I just personally, I'm never a fan of social engineering. I think people should be able to decide what they want to do that up to the point where it infringes on public safety. And not everybody's going to have a hedge, even if they were all allowed to, and we'll have variety on our streetscape, and I think that is a good community character.
Well, thank you very much. Anything else?
One last thing. On the visual clearance, what I would suggest is that maybe we can have 42 inches. You're just allowed to have that. And if you want to have up to 8 feet, we just have a small nominal permit fee, which will give an individual site-specific transportation review for visual clearance. It is different in every case. It's going to be very challenging to try to come up with an ordinance that addresses every case. We're going to be right back where we are today. Instead, let's have a nominal fee to cover a little bit of transportation staff time so that if you do want this thing, you can pay for it, get the review, and we will get it covered specifically in every case.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your comments. Ann Harkey, followed by Jill Kent.
Hello, thank you. I would have to say I agree very much with what the previous speaker was talking about, which is in Santa Barbara, we're a very regulated city, and I think if there are things you can do, and I'm encouraged that this ordinance is going in the direction of leaving people more discretion to do what they want with their properties. I have no concern really as to what people, if people want to look into my front yard, I really don't think I have to take their desires into consideration as to looking in my front yard. As far as the safety issues, I would really be curious if the transportation department or the police department could input how many accidents you have at corners and driveways, how many pedestrians are hit in the city every year by someone coming out of their driveway. I think a lot of these things sound logical, and we should do it. And we've been through this with curb extensions, and I'm not going to bring that up. So, because the statistics don't often support what people feel like is a good idea, what people feel like is a safety issue. So I think the more that you can let people alone to do what they want to do, the better off the city will be. One of the problems with the hedge ordinance in the past has been the arbitrariness of the enforcement, which is unfair, because if it's arbitrary, it's unfair. And unless you're going to apply these things to every single person in the city that owns property, it's necessarily unfair. So, and I think things like this are impossible to enforce across the city. So I'm just saying less would be better.
Great. We got it. Thank you.
And also, if I want to go to an association to get permission for what I want to do, then I would buy a property in a PUD or a condo project.
Jill Kent, followed by Marcus Lazaro, who will be our last speaker.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, to implement this ordinance, the city staff, a small number of employees, were left to interpret and enforce broad requirements of the ordinance only as a result of a complaint from an irate neighbor. The city doesn't have, as was mentioned, the number of employees to implement the rules of a complaint-driven ordinance. I do appreciate hearing today the possibilities of changes in the ordinance as suggested. Every property owner should have the right to property privacy. The majority of property owners in the city have installed and do maintain hedges and or fences surrounding their property for privacy and their own personal safety. This ordinance deprived them of that right. The previous conceived height limitation mandated by the ordinance did not address specifically elevations of properties that were contiguous or different heights of buildings between properties. These both impact privacy. If you have a hedge that's 8 feet tall in the interior of your property and you have a building next to you that is 2 stories tall, you do not have a privacy of your own property. These differences should be considered in any reasonable, concise, mandated hedge specifications of any ordinance. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. And then Marcus Lazaro, you'll be next and last.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, thank you. My name is Marcos Lazaro, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Santa Barbara Association of Realtors Government Relations Committee. Overall, we like the direction the staff report is going, but we don't have a position at this time until more specific language is drafted. That being said, we look forward to being stakeholders during this process to create an ordinance that works for both homeowners and the city. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay. With that, we'll close public comment and get back to the committee. I see Mr. Ross. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I have to agree. I really do like the direction staff is taking this and the flavor of what we're trying to do here. Obviously, we need some guidelines, but I think the phrase quiet enjoyment comes out in terms of what people can or cannot do with their properties. I think that's good. I'm intrigued by the one speaker's suggestion about neighborhood control associations. I'm not sure how that is the mechanics of that, how that could possibly work out. But the other thing I'd like to say is Mr. Hodge just brought up a comment. I do think that perhaps one other public input meeting outside of what we've got scheduled, maybe the Faulkner or whatever, maybe in October or somewhere around that time, because I think there's enough community interest in this to generate a more specific meeting about this issue. Thank you.
Great. Mr. Hotchkiss?
Thank you, sir. Well, from what everybody, I think, says here, including staff, is to have the most flexibility possible and for neighbors to work things out. I like the idea about, as long as people agree, just don't bring it to the city or anybody else. I also understand the need in certain situations for, I guess, absolute standards. But this city is so variegated in its properties that one rule applies logically one place, just it makes no sense at all in another. Having said that, I can't even point out to you specifically what I mean, except if you walk down the street, they're all different. I think the staff is trying to adjust for that. Am I correct in saying, Renee, that in essence is the thrust of your proposals or the staff's proposals, is to deal with these unique situations in a unique way?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Hotchkiss, that's exactly correct. Trying to adjust to these site-specific standards where a rigid requirement just doesn't always make logical sense.
Let me ask both you and Ms. Weiss, there have been some creative suggestions here today. Do you think some of them could be incorporated into what the staff is now proposing? Do you hear some ideas and go like, oh, that's kind of cool. Well, and you don't have to be specific. I'm just.
Yes, certainly. Some of the comments made do generate ideas for further consideration, and that's the purpose of the hearing process. As the staff report indicated, both the written report and Renee's presentation, is we do think it's important to give some general guidance as to some of the bigger questions, maintaining an ordinance, having it apply differently to hedges, looking at safety, looking at these issues so that the community dialogue has some shape for the discussion. But the purpose of this meeting, as well as the subsequent meetings, is to hear from the public, and the expectation would be that we would certainly, as we did today, hear good ideas for further consideration. Based on the ideas heard today, I think what would be helpful from the Ordinance Committee is commenting on some of the bigger ideas that would help frame the discussion. For example, the idea that we would have a set of standards that would look at site-specific considerations. One of the comments made by the public that is not in the staff proposal at this time is the input specifically from adjoining property owners, and the concept of if you have a standard but two adjoining property owners agree to go beyond that standard, that would be acceptable. That's a new concept that we didn't include. Similar to that is the concept that some other entity beyond even the two property owners would be involved. I would just say that I think that's actually problematic. I think that it would be hard to have a city ordinance that is, managed in some neighborhoods by a very active neighborhood association, and then in other neighborhoods where there is no association and people might also have problems accessing that input, whereas at the city, this is open access for all the residents of the community to come and seek, information and decisions by the city. So I'm intrigued by the idea of input from adjoining neighbors. A little bit more than the idea that an association would be involved. So that's just some initial feedback.
Yeah, I suspect you're right. And I was thinking of unintended consequences in the Upper East that might really work well, but other areas that might not. And there's no boundaries, really, as far as I know, specifically, or let's say that two organizations can overlap in some instances, I believe, I suspect. I don't know. Mr. Chair, do you want to take these?
Well, I want to,
one by one.
let me just give a couple comments, and we're going to go down this little list that the staff prepared for us. I think that'll help. I do want to say the general direction that I'm hearing, I feel really good about. I like the ability to have some of this flexibility at certain places. I also like renewing our understanding of the validity or not validity of the 3.5 feet and where it really is necessary. And I think templates or some sort of basic algorithm for how we do that. And I definitely see an app with your name on it, Mr. Bailey. But we're going to come up with something that we can use that has objectivity, some objective reality to it. Some of the situations that we have seen and heard about are really deal with elevation issues. I mean, all the way from that front yard railing to the side yard difference in many of our hillier neighborhoods where, 8 foot doesn't cut it, or going the other direction, it could be the opposite, So there's got to be some basic standard, but then some method in our system to really take a look at the individual situation and perhaps have the input from the adjoining neighbor beyond a standard. And beyond a standard, it might be the key. I saw you had an interest in speaking. We're not going to do any more public comment today, sir, but but there will be plenty of time for you to weigh in on this, I want to say. And I think the idea of the fences, I'll just start with this myself here, the hedges and fences being treated differently. I think there is some validity to that. We even see different kinds of fences that, like for instance, that safety fence on top of that wall, which poses it's almost invisible, is really different from something that might be opaque and much larger. But we need to really see these differently, and a standard that would be more rigid for fences on a side yard, for instance, that I could definitely see. Okay, so let's just make sure each of you and I have a chance to comment going down the list. Which one of you wants to start? We'll just go right down the little group there, and maybe you have some things you want to say about it. Mr. Rouse? Yeah, just go for it. Just take it from the top. And that was what was asked for from staff today, was some feedback after we heard public comment and give them some direction. So,
well, for every point I make to myself, I have a counterpoint, which is one of the problems with this hedge ordinance process in the first place. Interior setbacks, once again, I'll go back to the kind of the quiet enjoyment statement, but then I can also think of a few things we've had come before us regarding usually big stands of bamboo. And that can be a real issue, but I know you can't outlaw one particular species of plant, but I do know that that's an issue. So I would be in favor of not trying to regulate or trying to be specific about interior hedge heights, but if you have a 50-foot stand of bamboo, that may cause issues. So I don't know, maybe something along the lines of thinking about the solar and view aspects of what that does to your neighbor's property. Front lot lines, front lot lines, driveways, and street corners, to me, really boils down to safety and public passages. So if it's there's just incursions onto sidewalks or public right-of-way, that's a problem. If it's a safety issue, that's a problem. But I can think of, and I keep thinking about Upper East as one of the areas, and even Montecito, where you have these very much oversized hedges, and they're really not an issue in terms of public safety or impediments. So I think that'd be hard to control. And then the topography issue is something that's going to be almost impossible to make a uniform code or standard about. So I have some issues with that. And then, of course, there's administrative authority, and I know that our people are looking for some guidelines and some ability to have some teeth to help our neighbors, so it's not all neighbor v. neighbor, it's not the Wild West out there. But man, once again, every point I bring up, I can come up with a counterpoint for. So to me, that's why I was encouraging perhaps even another public input meeting. So because, like I said, we heard some ideas here today that weren't in the CAR that I really appreciated.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Rouse. Mr. Hotchkiss?
I think staff's going in the right direction on all of these things, and I appreciate their listening to the public comments, and I think they're correct in their assessment of those. And I would join Mr. Rouse in suggesting that we do have one more public session, maybe in the evening at Faulkner Gallery, so people can come. Thank you.
Okay. So you heard my general comments. Again, the flexibility piece is kind of important. I really take the comments of the first speaker, one size does not fit all. That's the hardest part of this process, and it may very well be that we need to establish or maintain a standard, but have built into our system a process for that kind of review that was suggested. I think Mr. Gorin suggested something, but the idea of having a way for two consenting neighbors to come and say, hey, you know, this, for our property, a 12-foot height works great. We would really like to have the ability to do that. And we've had people wanted to do it, and our code doesn't allow it. And I'd like an objective measure for safety with regards to the front side, the driveways, front and corners for hedges. And let's see, and then the dispute resolution piece really is where some of this comes, you know, gets awful. And it also can be that you have two consenting neighbors that own their properties, and then there's a change of ownership, and suddenly there's a whole new thing that's coming in, you know, and that's how do you deal with that? So these are difficult issues. I don't have solutions right now. Perhaps we'll get some more suggestions from the public if we do something more of an open discussion forum kind of thing. There's going to be plenty of opportunity. There's 5 that were right there before, you know, with City Council, at least 5 public hearings after this that you had up on the, yeah, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and maybe more. But to have something that would be really to make sure all the issues are out on the table, that would be maybe the purpose of that. And maybe the request could be for people to come with their ideas for solutions, not just to come and carp about it, but to give us some ideas about what they might see as solutions. Let's see if there's any other specific things here. Let's see.
Could I ask Mr. Chair if staff agrees with that would be helpful?
Oh, please, by all means. I've got a couple more things, but go ahead. What do you think?
You think that's too much, or a special session for this?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Hotchkiss, I think it's something we could consider, and as Chair House mentioned, I think we would want to have it at a time where we have some framework for people to comment on probably more specific elements or offer solutions, rather than you know, a general outpouring of maybe.
Right. It's got to be constructive. Agreed.
You know, of course, you know where I come from, a facilitated kind of environment which would be around coming up with constructive solutions would be different from, say, the typical panel speaking at the front of the room after a PowerPoint or something. But that takes a little extra effort. I know we have the capacity for that, though. Maintenance has always been a big issue. And, you know, you get something put in that's even according to the current standards, and it doesn't take too long with a hedge for it to be out of control and not be maintained, and then that becomes a real sticking point in the community, in a neighborhood. And so how do we deal with maintenance issues and consistency? Because that, I guess, as a city council person, that's the most of what I've heard since I've been on city councils, people coming to me and telling me about an issue or a neighbor or a situation that's, you know, maybe at one time was okay, but now it's just really awful. It's totally overgrown. So, and then lastly, to really reinforce the need to keep our right-of-way, that's not in here, but to make sure that that's really something I wish we would enforce more, and that perhaps isn't for today, but I would just make that comment. The hedges that are overgrown on the sidewalks, and in many cases you can't even be on the sidewalk, that really is what people confuse with this issue that we're dealing with today. It gets confused, and I think that's where we need more enforcement. Let's see, is there anything that you wanted to hear more about from us that we didn't really adequately answer? Ms. Brooke.
Mr. Chair, thank you for asking that. I think this has been a good discussion. We've heard some great input, and your direction, I think I generally understand in response to the direction that we provided. It seems like we're generally going in the right direction with trying to build in some flexibility, having some standards codified, of course, but with some flexibility and a process for people to deal with site-specific challenges. So I think unless Ms. Weiss wants to add more, it's been a good
okay.
meeting.
All right, very good. Ms. Weiss, anything?
I just think we need to look more at the question that's been raised by the committee members for additional public input and having that in a facilitated way. What is proposed in our process was to have hearings before bodies that, you know, review on behalf of the city these type of applications, be it for improvements to single-family homes in the neighborhood council. We're hoping to, you know, hear from those appointed people from the council that to represent generally across the board the neighborhoods in the community. We are trying to do this with limited staff resources. So I just want to take more time to think about that point. Is that what your direction is, or do you absolutely want us to have a process like that? That's
well,
something that would help me.
Let's address that directly, because we do know it will take additional staff resources, and is it something that we really feel strongly it's worth it? Mr. Ross?
No, I could totally get your point, Ms. Weiss. I understand the limits of staff resources. My problem with the schedule we have up there, it's all pretty much daytime and specific type of committee things. But I also realize we don't want to just have a free-for-all and just sit there for 3 hours and hear anecdotes. So it's probably more incumbent upon this committee to come up with more directive or maybe in a menu of questions and issues. I mean, staff has done that on some level, but the problem is we're trying to keep this loose, but at the same time make a regulation. So it's a kind of a hard thing to lasso down.
And
But
just to clarify where I am right now, I'm open to the idea. I just needed to know if you all are just open to the idea, or you really specifically want to see us do that.
Well, yeah, I guess once again the question would be: is it worthwhile to have an evening, more public access? Because just as many people showed up here in the middle of the day today, it just makes me wonder if there's not more interest.
I just want to say, I think that what you're hearing here is we feel this has got the possibility of being a contentious issue even after 5 of these kinds of hearings, and the priming the pump, if you will, with public input in a constructive venue of some sort. And for me, I mean, we've all seen the benefit of a facilitated kind of conversation. You get basic stuff put up on the wall, and then people begin to work in small groups or whatever they do. But to come back with some suggestions for what we might do that would be of benefit, that would help to resolve some of these issues. At least that would be something then that could be included in the discussions for the other groups. But then I would not be for just a presentation about the hedge ordinance and then just take 2-minute public comment kind of thing. That wouldn't be very constructive, I don't think. Mr. Hotchkiss, any other point on that?
This isn't a deal killer for me one way or the other. I mean, with email these days, you can get a lot of good input. So I'm kind of up in the air about it. One way or the other, it's okay, fine with me.
Okay, guys, we're doing sort of a 2-to-1 right here. So, Mr. Rouse, what do you think? You good?
That's fine. That's enough.
Enough to keep you going?
I understand what you're saying. If we're going to do this additional input, it would be done in a format different than these scheduled meetings.
Right.
I definitely understand that. And we'll just look at our schedule and our ability to pull something like that together. Definitely consider
My
that.
comment, and I think what I was hearing from the others, was earlier than later. The idea of not get too far down the road before you've had a chance to gather that.
Okay.
A sense of inclusion would really be helpful on the other end of the process.
Thank you.
All right, good. That's it then for everybody. Thank you, everyone, for coming out today. Really appreciate your input.